Hey friends, Kathryn here from Research Rockstar. Thanks for joining me here today. Today I'd like to talk about a topic I've been thinking about a lot lately. In fact, I wrote an article about it recently also, which is how we can make sure that as market research and insights professionals that we're conducting our analysis as objectively as possible. We all know that humans are subject to all sorts of biases, and in our profession, we tend to focus on the biases of the research participants. But indeed, many of the same biases are things that may show up in our actual research work, in how we actually analyze and synthesize data, how we write up our results, and so forth. So let's focus today on how we can make sure that we are mitigating the risk of potentially biasing our research by virtue of the fact that we're human beings and human beings are messy and have their various biases. So when we think about objectivity, in market research, obviously, we all have things that we do to try to make sure that when we are doing our analysis and we're doing our writing, that we're being as objective as possible. So what are some of the things that you do or your team does to make sure that your analysis, your key findings, your recommendations have really been based on objective data? Did you interpret your data truly objectively? And if you think about it, there are probably a few things that you do. For example, I know that some teams I work with, they'll have a team approach to actually doing the analysis and synthesis, where multiple people on the team will look at the final data and contribute to its interpretation so that no single researcher's biases have a risk of potentially creating bias in the interpretation. So having more than one person on the team be involved in the analysis and maybe even editing the writing before it goes to a client can be one great way of mitigating that risk. Another way that folks might use is by using a structured approach to analysis. That's an approach that we teach in some of the courses here at Research Rockstar. And a structured analysis approach is applied to both quantitative and qualitative data. So there are different things that you might do as an individual or as part of a team. Those are just a couple of examples. But when we think about it, it's still a skill. So if we think about objectivity, the ability to be objective, I think that's really a skill. And so how can I make sure that that's a skill that I continue to develop as a researcher? I really feel like this is part of my real value as a research and insights professional, is that my conclusions, my recommendations are based on my human but still very objective interpretation of my data. So if I want to make sure that I am being as objective as possible, I have to be honest with myself about my own biases, the lenses through which we see the world. And different people will have different types of biases. I will tell you that I have grown up in the Northeast. So not only do I have biases from being an American, I have certain biases from being in the Northeast. I've lived my whole life in the Northeast. And while I've traveled a lot throughout the country and even internationally, I definitely have certain biases from being a Northeasterner. It's just sort of built into my DNA. I know I also have some other biases. So if you think about it for yourself, based on perhaps your education, your cultural background, your family background, do you have certain biases? And could they possibly creep into your research analysis? So it's something we have to appreciate about ourselves, and it can get complex. Now, one of the things that I think is important is that when we're talking about any kind of skill, including being objective, that it is something that we can practice. So I want to make sure that I've got a way to practice being objective. And in the broader world of social sciences, instead of referring to just objectivity, they will often refer to critical thinking. And I think that's a really good way to sort of frame this conversation. I'm not just looking to be objective. I'm looking to make sure that I am practicing critical thinking. And I think that the phrase says a lot to me. And I don't take the word critical as a negative word, because being critical doesn't mean, in this context, isn't about putting things down for the sake of putting them down. Critical in this context is about making sure that I have had a rigorous process so that I didn't just jump to a conclusion, or worst yet, analyzing data, reaching a conclusion, and then stopping. Ouch. I want to see if there are alternative conclusions I could have drawn before I decide which one is the best. So that's part of critical thinking too, is not being lazy, right? Don't just go with that first conclusion or that first recommendation that comes to mind as you're doing your analysis. Really make sure that you give yourself the opportunity to consider a number of different key findings, conclusions, recommendations, and then to really assess them to make sure that they are truly supported by the data. Now, again, I think that this is a skill that we can practice. Now, I know for those of us who've been doing this for a long time, it can feel like, well, I do practice critical thinking. I appreciate that that's an important value in the world of market research and insights, and it's something that I do. So I don't really need to practice it. Well, I was watching a movie recently, and I know this is going to sound a little corny, but it was a documentary about the Rolling Stones. And even after all of these years, these decades and decades that the Rolling Stones have been performing, they still practice. And so in this particular film, they were getting ready for a big international tour, and there they were, Mick and Keith and Ron and Charlie, practicing for weeks before going out on the road. So even though I'm an experienced researcher, if the Rolling Stones can still practice before they go on the road, then I still have opportunity to practice and develop my skills too. So I want to talk a little bit more about critical thinking, and then let's try an exercise to see whether or not we are practicing it as market researchers. So first of all, a just sort of dictionary definition of critical thinking is that critical thinking is the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. Does that apply to market research? Yeah, we form judgments. When we're writing our research reports, we are forming judgments. We are drawing conclusions. We are hopefully writing inspiring, insight-igniting key finding statements, or as some people like to refer to them as our aha statements. And very often we're also making recommendations. So yeah, we're forming judgments. That is part of what we do. So I think, again, that this way of framing our objectivity as critical thinking, I really do think that that applies to us. But how do I know it? Like, how do I know that I'm really applying it, that I'm really practicing it? There are a lot of different resources online about critical thinking. Actually, the article that I wrote about this recently has some links. So if you go over to the Research Rockstar blog, you'll see that this article has some resources that I do recommend on the topic. But when we look at various sources on critical thinking, a common discussion or a common set of parameters comes up, and that is that for our thinking to truly be critical thinking, for us to really be practicing this, it has to exhibit 6 attributes. So there are 6 specific attributes that we can use to say, hey, which of these things am I really doing, so that I can assess whether or not I am practicing critical thinking. So clarity is the first item. That makes sense. If I'm analyzing something, I need to be very clear about what I'm analyzing. Accuracy, again, I think that fits market research and insights work. Obviously, we want to make sure that what we're analyzing and our analysis is accurate. And then there's the concept of depth and breadth, which again is really something that we use a lot when we talk in market research. For example, if you've ever been in a meeting where we're planning a methodology for a new project, one of the topics of discussion can often be about depth and breadth. That is, do we want this study to be a study that's very broad, but probably not very deep, or do we want to focus on a really specific topic and get super deep? And that is a legitimate choice. Depending on what kind of business or marketing issue that you're grappling with that you want the analysis to inform, there can be appropriate trade-offs between depth and breadth. And then, of course, precision. And precision, I think, is really applicable to a lot of the work that I know I've done in research, where if we're not precise enough, then our analysis kind of falls flat. Like early in my career, I did a whole bunch of customer satisfaction studies. It was something I did a lot of for a few years. And one of the things that you learn very early on in customer sat work is that precision is important, because if you only ask a lot of high-level general questions about satisfaction, well, you might be able to determine that satisfaction is lower or higher than you'd hoped for, or that it's been increasing or decreasing overall, but you may not have information that's precise enough to help you do any course corrections. And that's terrible, right? You don't want to do a customer satisfaction study and say to the client, oh, your satisfaction isn't really where you wanted it to be. It's at this level, but I can't tell you how to fix it, right? Not very useful. So that's a great way that the concept of precision applies specifically in our work in market research. But my favorite aspect of thinking about the definition of critical thinking is that if you read articles from various social science fields about critical thinking, a key attribute is that we're working with empirical data, which is, of course, what we as market researchers love to do, right? We love empirical data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative data, whether it's data that we're collecting ourselves through primary research or through trusted sources. We love having empirical data. So let's just take a quick look and make sure that we all agree on what the definition of empirical data is. So empirical data it can be quantitative or it can be qualitative. That doesn't matter. The point is that it's verifiable, right? It's not an assumption. It's not my conventional thinking or a conventional wisdom or a rule of thumb about a product category or a customer group or market segment. It's about having data that was collected through either direct or indirect experience or observation that can be verified. How do we verify data? Well, in market research, we can verify data a few different ways. We may do an extra data collection. We may compare data collected, say, from a survey to data collected from a related qualitative study to see if the results were consistent. We may bring in experts who also have direct experience with the topic to get them to verify our conclusions. We may decide that we're going to collect more data. Or acquire secondary data that's relevant to do a little triangulation that way. So we do have options for verifying our data. But an important point here is that to verify data, we typically need more than one data source. Those of you who've taken report writing courses with me know that this is one of my big rants about market research. Too often in market research, we do a project based on a methodology, and we come up with these big conclusions and recommendations. It's still just based on one study. So it hasn't been verified. If I don't have multiple data sources, if I don't have multiple phases, if I don't have access to other research that's on the same topic, I haven't verified it yet. And that's something that is a little bit troubling if I'm trying to practice critical thinking. I need to make sure that I'm working not only with my primary data that I've collected, but that I'm also looking at opportunities to verify my data. So one thing I do want to point out is that for those folks who do primarily survey-based research, in an ideal world, we would do a survey and then we would replicate it, right? We would do another survey and see if we got the same results. In reality, in commercial research, we don't do this, right? You might see that sort of exercise done in academic research or, of course, in healthcare research. But in commercial market research, it's typically not something that we have the time or the budget to do. But that doesn't mean we can't verify our data. That's just one possible way we could if we wanted to. All right. So I know I've made this big point about how important critical thinking is and how it's a skill that we all can practice. So how do we do it? How do I know if I'm doing a good job as a critical thinker when I'm interpreting and writing up my research results, right? So how do I know that I'm really doing it? So here's an exercise that you can try to see for yourself. It's sort of a self-assessment. Decide whether or not at the end of this exercise, were you being objective? Could you have been doing a more rigorous job of your critical thinking? So let's take a look at this exercise. Here's what I want you to do. And again, I want you to do this either as an individual or with your team. If you can do it with a team, that's really ideal. So if you're part of a team, try to get your team to watch this video and hit pause and do this exercise together and then compare notes. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go and get one of your, perhaps your most recent research report. And I don't care what the topic was. Maybe it was customer satisfaction or message testing or ad testing. And I don't care if it was quantitative or qualitative. What I want is your most recent market research report. Then what I want you to do is look over the key findings and pick one. So in a typical professional research report, even if it was a small project, there's typically going to be 3 or 4 key findings, those aha statements that really sort of summarize the essence of what we learned from the research endeavor. So I want you to select just one of them. And then what I want you to do is I want you to rewrite it and the opposite. So really, I'm asking you to play devil's advocate with yourself. It can be hard to do, but I really want you to do it. So let's say, for example, if in your recent research study, you had a conclusion that says that segment B customers are likely to respond favorably to the new package design. Okay, that's a good conclusion. Now I want you to restate it. Segment B customers are unlikely to have a positive reaction to the new package design. So I want you to take that key finding and literally flip it. So you're going from segment B is likely to respond favorably to the new design to segment B is unlikely to respond favorably to the new design. Then what I want you to do is I want you to go through your data. I want you to find proof points for your new conclusion. And I want you to really try. Don't just start filtering things out because of any reason. Even if you feel that it's a proof point that you wouldn't actually want to use in real life because maybe it's based on a small subgroup, or maybe there's something else that's causing you to want to filter it out. Try not to put on that filter. Try to collect all of the data points you have that could possibly support your devil's advocate position and really put it together. Give yourself some time for this. It can feel a little painful. But here's what's going to happen. After you go through this exercise, I want you to stop and really reflect on what happened. Did you uncover something that you didn't see before? One source of bias that we as researchers have is we do have a tendency to exhibit confirmation bias, or the related inattentional blindness bias. That is, very often in research, we have a specific hypothesis that we're trying to prove or disprove, and very often we end up proving our hypotheses were correct, right? So this is an opportunity to see, well, is this something that we could be doing a better job of? So we know we have that bias, of confirmation bias, we have inattentional bias. So I want to make sure that we did see something. And I think that if you really did a good job on the exercise and gave yourself some time, my hunch is that most of us will find that there were a couple of data points that in the initial analysis we had dismissed maybe too readily, and that maybe there is some merit in some of these data points. Now, I'm not saying that based on this exercise you're going to want to go back to that old research report and totally rewrite it. However, maybe you would have learned something, or maybe you learned something from the exercise that could have been an important addition to a key finding statement, or something that you can apply the next time you're studying that particular topic. So did you discover something that you hadn't seen before? And did you learn anything about your own biases? Did you learn something about what type of data you're likely to dismiss maybe a little bit prematurely? Did you find that you had any sort of cultural bias as you went through the data? So there could be different types of bias that come up. And did you maybe learn something from yourself, about yourself, as you went through the exercise? Challenging your own analysis is really hard. Playing devil's advocate with yourself is really hard, but I truly believe that doing exercises like this can just be a great way for us to realize, yes, I am a human being and I do have biases. Even though I try to be super objective as a market research and insights professional, I do have biases. So I do want to practice this and make sure I'm being consistent, and knowing what my biases are, I think I will be more rigorous going forward. So I hope the exercise was helpful. If you do the exercise and you want to share your experience, please do add comments here, or feel free to contact me at the Research Rockstar website or to send me a message on our LinkedIn or Facebook pages. So I hope you all found that conversation today helpful. Again, there is a longer article that has some helpful links to additional resources, and that is over at the Research Rockstar blog. And for those of you who are enjoying this conversation either on YouTube as a video podcast or on iTunes in audio format, it's really important that we get as many subscribes and likes and reviews as possible. So if you could do me a favor and like, subscribe, write a review, just a couple of words, it would be really helpful. The more of that kind of stuff that we have, the nicer the YouTube and iTunes search engines are to us. So thank you. I appreciate it. Again, if you have any questions, please do feel free to contact me, and I will look forward to seeing you in our next conversations. I also want to mention that we have a bunch of great classes coming up at Research Rockstar. We've got our courses on data analysis, questionnaire design. We've got courses coming up on online qualitative research that I'm very excited about. And we also have some courses coming up on writing and writing in general, as well as writing research reports specifically. So again, thanks for your time, and I hope to see you here again soon.